to Flat Earth Nation Golden Age Past, formerly Flat Earth Nation Golden Age Past, now called Mud Flood was Armageddon because it is a Flat Earth Nation. The Golden Ages past, Mud Flood definitely was Armageddon. Don't let them tell you anything else unless they're willing to debate you in a fair and honest way. I did a review show last night. I woke up this morning and saw that the delightful and wonderful homeschool mom, Shelley from There's No Place Like Home, was doing a review show and she covered a lot of topics. And last night, even though I was showing videos of people that were, giving me shout outs, like I first heard about the millennial reign from FinDap and FinGap, names I used to go by, they were still off on different things that we couldn't quite be sure about. Like, well, I don't even want to get into it, but I do want to get into something about World War II and just let us know what we know for sure. And I know for sure inside myself, World War II was a fake. I know that the winners of the war rewrite history for the people who are going to read history for the rest of their lives and teach it to their children and watch movies about it and watch movies about how they learned something from this war, from the rockets and that took them to the moon and everything else that goes on with it. And so my contention is tonight is World War I was fake. All of the countries that we know about from the, let's say 1900s, uh, probably earlier, but at least through the 1940s, were studying eugenics. Each one thought their country was number one. When in Welcome Kingdom Within, the first one to enter into the chat room, Fractal Bear is here. Good day, even though this is mostly going to be a United States centric, since they're the ones who were credited with the atomic bomb, which I think, I've pretty solidly proven that they couldn't use fake math of quantum physics and Schrodinger's cat and Einstein to develop a new theory on math with discovering dark matter, and 97% of the universe is dark matter. And then with that maps or with that string theory and new math, develop atomic weapons that could blow up the world. So for the rest of our lives, we would be afraid of it. And I certainly don't believe that the United States spent all their time and money and mercifully, by the grace of God, developed two bombs that they were surprised that worked, that blew up two cities, and yay, they saved millions of lives of having to rush into Japan. And I think I'll be able to prove that. Missed you last night, Matt G. Welcome again, Marcella. Wonderful to see you here. And also, there's going to be tie-ins. I've got a couple of movie reviews. If you stick around until the end, things you should see, things that tie in. Was Aleister Crowley tied in to the British intelligence agency? Did he work with Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond movies? Not only James Bond movies, but Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And you remember, that's kind of a horror movie in itself. It starts out so happy and fun, but then ends up with the guy trying to kill all the babies, them having to hide all the children because who knows, they're probably cooking them and eating them. But the history of World War II. And just as a warm up, I see it, so thankful that 15 people have already hopped on. But let's keep things real here. We want to realize, that I'm your big mushroom boy. I think that there's a lot of help, and what is the mycelium? What is this organs of the fungus? Here's a video, and this is strictly fair use. And we'll just listen to a couple of seconds here.
Eat rock. They produce spores that release acid, breaking up the rock's surface. Fast-growing fungal filaments, hyphae, then drill into the rock to extract a meal of minerals. Using pressure 100 times greater than inside a car tire,
He said the pressure is 100 times greater than inside a car tire, and that the fungus from the mushrooms, and the mushrooms are only the fruit of it, but they eat the rocks because the rocks are food.
the tips of the hyphae can crush the rock.
What we're looking at here is a kind of molecular mining operation. It's this sort of process through which fungi turn rock to life.
Well, in my world, we are living stones. Christ is the rock of our salvation. And that's one of the things we're still working on to figure out. We don't have all the answers on that, but it's good to see that, we're on the right track. We're on the right track. The Second Sino-Japanese War lasted from 1937 to 1945. In Chinese terms, it was the War of Resistance between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. I wish I had time to go into the Pearl of Great Price and or the Pearl by the Buck. Wasn't that the name of the lady who wrote the book, Pearl Buck? Uh, John Birch Society. The communists, the Catholics, and what was going on over there. We don't even have time to get into the Marco Polo Bridge incident from July 7th, 1937, the rape of Nanking. But we do know that China fought Japan with aid from Nazi Germany, so they were part of the Axis. The Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, they were what was called the United Nations. Before the United Nations were the United Nations, the Axis powers were the United Nations. And it was after Pearl Harbor, which is pretty much universally agreed on that it was known about. How much was known is only debated. But how did it end? It says that, and did you know that Japan had been, kicking China's butt for years? And again, everyone thought in terms of eugenics. They were playing chess on a world stage. The United States was in the middle of a Great Depression. Let's see what else we can glean from this. The rape of Nanking, if it just shows the rape of Nanking shows the horrors of when you look down on people as not being real people. Kind of like what some religions, consider goyim not real people. Some people in other religions consider that they don't really have a soul. They don't really have a soul. Much was made about the Chinese Air Force. Much was made about the Flying Tigers, Ho Chi Minh, not Ho Chi Minh, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, people that were all about it. Here's Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, far from the person that, the peasant Chinaman, educated, uh, world leader. Things got bad in China. The Star Fort cities, the Great Walls, many things were different. There's the Soviet embassy being burnt down. Many of the beheadings because they didn't really consider them people. Collaborativist Chinese army, maybe helping Japan. They worked in Japan as a real country there in Manchukuo for many years, a propped up King, that movie, Steven Spielberg, The Last Emperor, that was about in Manchukuo. There's Chiang Kai-shek meeting with Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell in 1942. Mao Zedong was, also popular working with the communist relief organizations, United China Relief, in the United States. They were our great friends. There they are at the Cairo conference in 1943. We're going to be looking at some conferences in Tehran and Yalta where they planned the defeat of Japan to help China. And it just coincided with, coincidentally, and if you still believe in coincidence, I want you to go down to the store and pick me up some. It's right next to the bottles of luck and chance that they sell. You still believe in coincidences? It was the week that they supposedly dropped the bomb. And when you see all of the details, how the Soviet Union and Germany were friends with Russia, and then within a month of it said they're in their fine print of their treaty from Yalta and Tehran conferences that, well, for at least a month after there's peace in the war, we won't attack you for any reasons. 47 seconds after that month was over, the Soviet Union turned their back on their former friends, the Japanese, and rubbed out the first army. And the first army of Japan was their main defense. Their main defense wasn't in China. It wasn't in the Battle of Midway or Iwo Jima. Those were all just distractions. And that just happened to be the same week that they dropped the bombs. And then later on, they came up with a cover story of, look at that city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was a massive bomb. It looks just like Tokyo in the pictures and everything else. It was all fake. I believe I'm going to be able to prove that. Yeah, 47 seconds after their month expired, Soviet Union took out Japan because they had it all lined up and in place. Stick with this now. It's a slow build, but it'll be with it. This was all everybody who was really white. They were working with the Shah of Iran is going to be getting in here from the Tehran conference, and how they put him in power to keep oil in there so that they could keep making money for the rest of their history. The Flying Tigers, volunteers from the United States, helped the Chinese, had to fly in, like they flew in the food to uh, East Germany, rescue. We were great friends with China before we were their big enemies. The airlift, China airlift delivered 650,000 tons of material over the Burma mountains. The Burma Trail cost, 1,659 men, almost 600 airplanes. That's, what they lost in the Afghanistan and uh, Iraq wars, about 4,000 in those 20 years. More people committed suicide. Things were just crazy. So here's the pictures of how this war could very well be coming to the United States. It's already destroyed Europe. And this was part of why the CIA and the FBI hate each other today. The Catholics in America, the CIA, they wanted to support Chiang Kai-shek. The FBI wanted to support Mao Zedong. The Chinese, you know, uh, Chiang Kai-shek ended up getting, his butt kicked and swept onto Taiwan. Mao Zedong wanted to take it over, and they still do. They still consider it's one China. That's still an armistice. That's still undecided. And this, of course, is where Taiwan, where, Nancy Pelosi last summer famously went to stir up war, and check on her investments, because this is where all your microprocessors and computer chips come from, as most of them come from this island. Mass panic, murder in the streets, beheadings, real war, real war. So these, we'll keep this open in case we have to come back and look at it. Both sides use propaganda. The Harbin Kieran offensive, we'll be looking at that later. The now let's hopefully this map is what the Soviet Union used as it closed in on the Japanese. They were friends, so they weren't expecting, that within 1 month we're going to go from friends to enemies. And the dates, you believe in coincidence that it happened during that week of both atomic weapons? They took the big cities, and this is why Japan ended the war. It wasn't because all of a sudden, the United States and its allies had been burning down city after city, and they were willing to take it because they were winning the war. The Manchurian offensive. The Manchurian, let's see here. Operation began on August 9th, 1945. Highlight, right click, search, August 9th. Victory. They won the war. The war was over. Drop the bombs. On August 6th was the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Sure. August 9th, the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And when you study that they are, built it in secret, and had to keep it as our number one spies, the Manhattan Project, the Catholics, like in the University of Chicago, all of those different things. It's just, these are things that when you know that the winners of the war rewrite history, that can't be something you just say. That has to be something that you know. It has to be something that you believe, and then it's your job to find out how much did they rewrite history, because they did. The operation has sometimes been called Operation August Storm. I tried to, there is no real page Operation August Storm on Wikipedia. I think I have a PDF. It goes back to the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, something that I did, I have pulled up. So I won't click that again. Let's see the commencement. It says, although the commencement of the invasion fell between the American, it means the United States, atomic bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August, only hours before the Nagasaki bombing on the 9th of August, the timing of the invasion had been planned well in advance and was determined by the timing of the agreements at Tehran and Yalta. The long-term buildup of Soviet forces in the Far East since Tehran, Conference of Tehran, and the date of the German surrender some 3 months earlier, so it must have been 3 months, on August 3rd, reported to Premier that if necessary, he could attack on the 5th. but they waited to do their thing. It was at August 8th, 1945, informed the Japanese ambassador that the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan, and that from August 9th, the Soviet government would consider itself to be at war with Japan. 1 minute past midnight, the Soviets commenced their invasion simultaneously on three fronts to the east, west, and north of Manchukuo, which was, for all intents, a colony of Japan. I hope I looked up end of World War II in Japan. In Asia, that's where it was on. It was, well, later in August when they signed the surrender. And, it says here, before that, the United States dropped two atomic bombs and the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, causing Emperor Hirohito to announce the acceptance. Well, they didn't announce, and I don't have the exact dates in my memory, but they didn't tell the world, oh, Japan surrendered because of atomic bombs right away. That came out later after they came with, oh, we got to come up with some better reason to make us the heroes. And they had this whole secret, Los Alamos. Let's see. Due to the Soviet Japanese Neutrality Pact, the Soviets made it policy to intern Allied aircrews who landed in Soviet Union. The following operations against Japan, although airmen held in Soviet Union under such circumstances were usually allowed to escape. Okay. Nevertheless, even before the defeat of Germany, the Soviet buildup in the Far East steadily accelerated. By early 1945, it had become apparent to the Japanese that the Soviets were preparing to invade Manchuria. Well, maybe it didn't appear that way. At the Yalta Conference, that was February 1945, amongst other things, Stalin secured from Roosevelt the promise for Stalin's Far Eastern territorial desires in return for agreeing to enter the Pacific War within 2 or 3 months of the defeat of Germany. These are things that we need to know. And these are things that we can know, unlike why didn't people need bathrooms in the buildings in St. Petersburg? Those are things that you can't build your theology around because there's no answers in the Bible. There's no answers anywhere. And just because it's fun guessing and saying, you don't know everything and you can't prove me wrong, well, you can't prove yourself right. But there are certain things that we can know about these names, these conferences. So it just turned out to be a great big rout and a great big fake. So we looked up August 45. That's when it was. I looked up Karaticus, and because that was the name of. We're going to be looking at Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Ian Fleming and how the Nazis and Aleister Crowley and the occult. Hess, was it Rudolf Hess, tried to fly to meet with the English to warn them about the Nazis, and he was held prisoners, and he was questioned by Aleister Crowley and Ian Fleming. And Ian Fleming wrote James Bond, basically warning us about Spectre. Where did he get those ideas? And he also, along with, telling us and warning us about evil in the world, he painted the CIA as the good guys, good guys with the license to kill. So I know that the name of the star, the Dick Van Dyke character, was Caraticus Potts. I looked up Caraticus, found out he was an ancient king, and was that affected? Well, even in the United States, Thomas Jefferson's at the time, his most well-known riding horse was named Caraticus. So, you know, they know those things, and it's time for us to understand them. We understand war, and that it's much more than just, our guy, my dad can beat up your dad. When it's nations at war, you have to have these military analysis networks, joint tactical information distribution systems. This is from 1997, and in 1997, you need people planning. And in 1997, this was what, the United States said, what was their ring of defense? Well, Navy fighters, Air Force fighters, submarines, whatever that is, U.S. naval carriers, tornadoes from the UK, United States. This is we call that a AWAC. They call it a E3. Navy ships, rivet joints, United States Air Force MPCs, UK E3s, FRE3s, whatever a MAOC is, USAF Joint Stars. The Army has to have, its gear together. You just need field artillery, whatever a USAFC MCE is, U.S. course, surface to air missiles, command and control centers. A lot of money has to be spent on wars and the rewriting of wars, because what do we do now? We have to have this because people believe that it's, stay away from mutually assured destruction. I guess I have these two Bible verses the Lord pulled up, and we'll just look at some of these. How much did God love? God made covenants with people. He expected he'd keep his covenant if they did. What did Jeremiah 24 say? Let's just, but thus says the Lord, like the bad figs that are so bad they cannot be eaten, so will I treat Zedekiah, the king of Judah, his officials, the remnant of Jerusalem who remain in this land, and those who dwell in the land of Egypt. I will make them a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth, to be a reproach, a byword, a taunt, and a curse in all the places where I shall drive them. And I will send sword, famine, and pestilence among them until they shall be utterly destroyed from the land that I gave to them and their fathers. So, it's time for us to stop believing the people that, yay, yay, America and Israel. God speaks in different terms about Israel than they would have us believe if we want to read the Bible. Thus says the Lord God. This is from Jeremiah 19 and the end of verse 3. Hear the words of Lord, O kings of Judah, inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am bringing such disaster upon this place that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle, because the people have forsaken me and have profaned this place by making offerings to it in it to other gods whom neither they nor their fathers nor the kings of Judah have known, and because they have filled this place with the blood of innocents and have built palaces, high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal. Verse 7, and I will make And in this place I will make void the plans of Judah and Jerusalem. And I'm asking you, if he did that before the destruction of by using Nebuchadnezzar, and then when Jesus came back, were those Jews any better? Had they improved? Were the prophecies still true that they were just in it for the money? Verse 8, and I will make this city a horror, a thing to be hissed at. So you go ahead and pray for the peace of fake Jerusalem if you want to. I think you're wasting your time, and that the winners of fake wars have rewritten history, and it's time for us to wake up. Everyone, it continues in verse 8 of Jeremiah 19, everyone who passes by it will be horrified and hiss because of all its wounds. And I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and their daughters, and everyone shall eat the flesh of his neighbor in the siege and in the distress with which their enemies and those who seek their life afflict them. And it there are many places in the Bible where the idea isn't just to love Jerusalem no matter what. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem no matter what they do, how evil they get. That's not the Bible. A covenant is a covenant. If we both agree that this is what's going to happen. If you do your side, I'll keep you blessed. If you don't, there is pages of curses of what's going to happen to you. And when you're in a country, you know, to where you're supporting abortion, and we'll just go let's go to Jeremiah 43. They went back to Egypt. So the Israelites went back to Egypt in 43. In 44, Jeremiah is still talking to them. And then all the men who knew that their wives had made offerings to other gods, and all the women who stood by a great assembly, who lived in the land of Pathros, in the land of Egypt, answered Jeremiah, as for the word that you have spoken to us into the name of the Lord, we will not listen to you, but we will do everything that we have vowed. Make offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pour out drink offerings to her, as we did, both we and our fathers, our kings and our officials, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food. They hated the God of the Bible. And the women, when we made our offerings to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, was it without our husband's approval? Therefore your land has become a desolation, a waste, and a curse. It's time for us to wake up and smell the coffee. So back to the war and the rewriters of history. Here is a 402 page on that. This is all I could find on is a couple of, how the defense was, Japan was going to win the war, and it took the Soviet Union to, break their treaty, with Japan and say, okay, we can't be neutral with you anymore. We're going to go with the United States, who we were helping fight the Nazis with and stuff like that, you know. So where is the introduction on this? The introduction had some good stuff. The Soviet Far East Command Strategy Offensive of August 1945, make that a little bigger. against the Kwantung Army shattered Japanese defenses around the periphery of Manchuria in 7 days that week of the two bombs and achieved total victory in less than 2 weeks, ending Japanese domination of northeastern Asia. The command commenced a strategic development operation, a self-styled canny, by attacking shortly after midnight on the 9th of August, 1945, with three separate fronts with a total of 10 armies, one cavalry mechanized group, and more than 1 million men. That's how Japan was defeated. The surprise Soviet offensive achieved immediate, spectacular success, crushing, the main army of Japan. So back to, here's the Yalta conference. Let's see, first we'll look at the Tehran conference. The Tehran Conference was a strategy meeting of Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill as early as November 1943. And as we saw in the other ones, they admit that's when they planned this. That's when they knew, hey, we can't beat Japan unless we do it together. White power. It was held at the Soviet Union's embassy in Tehran, Iran. It was the first of the World War II conferences of the Big Three, closely followed by the Cairo Conference. Let's see, there's a couple of quotes here where it talks about the United Nations, but we'll find them. Once the German-Soviet War broke out in June 1943, Churchill offered assistance to the Soviets, and an agreement to that effect was signed on July 12, 1941. However, Churchill, in a spoken radio transmission announcing the alliance with the Soviets, reminded listeners that the alliance would not change his stance against communism. But if you need him to beat Japan, enemy of my enemy is my friend for a while. The proceedings, Avril Harriman was there. He's a big banker, businessman, descendant of one of the robber barons, railroad barons. Rich people's money. Here's the Shah of Iran meeting with Winston Churchill. You can't see his braces. He was elected 4 times and the people didn't even know he was in a wheelchair. But this is the Shah of Iran shortly after his father's forced abdication during the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. And don't worry, we're going to prop you up until we don't need you anymore. And you're going to be our friend selling us oil. The Big Three. Shah of Iran pictured with the right with Joseph Stalin. Come on, mouse, work. Let's see. So I didn't look at the Operation Migration to divert German forces from northern France, but it's just rewritten history. Here's footage from the Cairo and Tehran conferences. Remember, it was a different world back then. United Nations leaders. And they said the United Nations wasn't developed until when? 1947, 48. when they, admitted Israel. Israel became a country and the United Nations accepted them. Here it says United Nation leaders met in 1943.
In the shadow of the pyramids near Cairo, Egypt, in the heart of the Muslim world, the leaders of China, Great Britain, and the United States meet face to face for the first time. President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, united in the war against the Empire of Japan. Madam Chiang Kai-shek is here as advisor and interpreter to her husband. The high commands of the United Nations powers mapping the blows that will strip Japan of the vast empire gained through 50
Where's Stalin?
years of terror and aggression. Three great allies pledged to a common cause, the unconditional surrender of Japan. To Tehran, capital of Iran, the conferences moved.
It looks like Tehran wasn't a peasant city then. It looks like it was a working capital.
Here, 6,000 miles from Washington, 2,700 miles from London, and 1,500 miles from Moscow, the President and Prime Minister meet their great ally in the war against Nazi Germany, Marshal Joseph Stalin, Premier of Soviet Russia.
Did you know that wasn't his real name? It's his stage name. Stalin means steel. So it's like saying, it's Joe Steele, Jack Armstrong, President Joe Steele.
The dramatic conference for which the world has watched and waited. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, climaxing a series of meetings that began with the Atlantic Charter and carried on through Casablanca and Moscow.
I'm just saying that if I was one of the three big leaders and I was as short as fat as Winston Churchill, wouldn't you ask for a different chair and say, can't I have a chair as high as the wheelchair and the other chair that Stalin is sitting in? It just looks ridiculous.
Ceremony highlights the meeting. The presentation of the Sword of Stalingrad, gift of Britain's king to the people of the heroic city. Marshal Stalin accepts the tribute on behalf of the Russian people.
Don't drop it.
Backed by the greatest concentration of military power in history, the Tehran Conference broadcasts its official communique to the world. We, the President of the United States of America, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the Premier of the Soviet Union, have met and expressed our determination that our nation shall work together in the war and in the peace that will follow. The common understanding which we have here reached guarantees that victory will be ours. We came here with hope and determination. We leave here friends in fact, in spirit, and in purpose.
History has been made, and it is far better history for the whole human race than any that we've known or even dared to hope for in these tragic times through which we pass. A great beginning was made in the Moscow Conference last October by Mr. Molotov, Mr. Eden, and our own Mr. Howe. There and then the way was paved for the later meetings. At Cairo and Tehran, we devoted ourselves not only to military matters, we devoted ourselves also to consideration of the future.
I'll bet they did.
The kind of world which alone can justify all the sacrifices of this war. At Cairo, Prime Minister Churchill and I spent 4 days with the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. It is the first time that we'd had an opportunity to go over the complex situation in the Far East with him personally.
And little did he know he was going to get double crossed and forced onto the island of Taiwan and disgraced.
All peace and security in the Pacific and in the rest of the world is the permanent elimination of the Empire of Japan as a potential force of aggression. Never again must our soldiers and sailors and Marines and other soldiers, sailors and Marines be compelled to fight from island to island as they are fighting so gallantly and so.
It does seem that in their war of eugenics, when they were all going to be all about, our country's better than your country, and everyone said, okay, well, let's just go for the resources. We'll play worldwide risk, that Japan would have won if three didn't say, no, we can't do this. They're kicking our butt.
The Chinese ground and air forces, augmented by American air forces, are playing a vital part in starting the drive which will push the invaders into the sea. Following out the military decisions at Cairo, General Marshall has just flown around the world and has had conferences with General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz, conferences which will spell plenty of bad news for the Japs in the not too far distant future. After the Cairo conference, Mr. Churchill and I went by airplane to Tehran.
So as you can see, you can find these, when you want to study the, Japanese side and how it ended the war and things yourself. We don't want to spend a half hour watching them all right now, but we'll glean a little bit more. What's so restricted about this? Just different footage before they added the captions, it looks like. No volume. You could say they were saying anything they want. But we know that they were planning on rewriting history and saying, that they were the United Nations. Let's see, the Steward of Stalingrad. The reason I kept saying, don't drop it, don't drop it. Before the tripartite dinner meeting on November 29, 1943, Churchill presented Stalin with a specially commissioned ceremonial sword, the Sword of Stalingrad, made in the sword capital of the world, Sheffield, England, as a gift from King George VI. When Stalin received the sheath sword, he took it with both hands and kissed the scabbard. He then handed it to Marshal Kliment Voroshkov, who mishandled it, causing the sword to fall to the ground. We missed that part. Joseph Stalin, in a quote from during the dinner at the Tehran conference, said, without American machines, the United Nations could not have won the war. Well, they considered the war won as of 1943, and it was just a cleanup and a rewrite since then. Let's see, did I have the United Nations thing pulled up? So anyway, what they have listed as the United Nations were the allies of World War II. The allies, formerly referred to as the United Nations from 1942, were an international military coalition, not exactly what they say the United Nations are today, formed during the Second World War to oppose the Axis power led by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, three very small countries. Its principal members were the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. And don't those countries have veto power today where, one person can say, nope, we're not going to do it? Very, very strange things go on in what they call the United Nations. And now we find out it wasn't a continuation or something that was like, oh, the League of Nations was a good idea after World War II. We should start something else like it. It was actually during World War II when you heard them say they were preparing for the future that our parents lived in and now you live in, one in which they could fake everybody with, the abundance of dark matter, quantum physics, quantum jumping, gravity slingshots around planets, nuclear power. And I'm not saying that there's not something going on of hidden power of things, but the United Nations, the allies of World War II. What else do I have pulled up? So I did have that pulled up. The declaration by the United Nations was the main treaty formalized the allies of World War II. It was signed by 47 national governments between 1942 and 1945. The declaration by the United Nations became the basis of the UN, the United Nations, which was formalized in the UN Charter signed by 50 countries June 26, 1945. So here they are. One world mafia, one world treaty, fighting for freedom. Do you feel like they're fighting for your freedom? The Yalta Conference was in 1945, where they put the finishing touches on the dates of August in that week when they're going to fake the atomic bombs. The Soviet-Japanese War, the Liberation War of 1945. In summary, the commencement of the invasion fell between the United States atomic bombings on August 6th and August 9th of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US and UK atomic bomb program. So, and there's been movies, you saw them, you know, the United States had to go send people, they were afraid that Hitler was going to discover the bomb. They were afraid Japan was working on the bomb. Turns out, you know, they'd all heard rumors of it, but they couldn't get it to work because the math doesn't work. 1 minute passed. 1 minute past midnight. So anyway, it just, continued on. I have more tabs. As agreed with the United States, United Kingdom, the Tehran Conference, they attacked and they rewrote history. These are things we know. The Kwantung Army. The Kwantung Army formed in 1906 as a security force for the lease territory and the Manchurian Railroad Zone. Because, it wasn't just the rape of Nanking. They were taking over and kicking Chinese butt in Asia and Russia. They beat Russia and China in two separate wars, and this was their world. Still horses, still cars for the rich, and mud flooded buildings looking in pretty good shape. And this was the army that was defeated. It So Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and I'm not going to stay long on this. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was a 1968 musical fantasy written, it says the film directed by Ken Hughes, no relation, with a screenplay written by Roald Dahl, greatest storyteller for children, from an Ian Fleming novel, best known as the James Bond spy novelists. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and the Magical Car. The plot involved, rebuilding a race car. They had, Toot Sweets as a candy. Uh, Truly Scrumptious was the hot girl that fell for the older guy. Isn't that everybody's dream? The Nasty Baron Bomb Burst, Bulgaria, who was, Bulgaria, was bad. Uh, the Baron hated children, but he was childlike. They had a child catcher. A lot of weird stuff going on in that movie. The child catcher, fictional character employed by the Baron to snatch and imprison and kill. The toy maker kind of sounds like the game maker now in the movies for the Hunger Games and different things like that. And Karaticus, first time people hear that name. A movie you might want to look at with fresh eyes the next time you see it, a leftover from yesterday as we studied that generation for a little bit, realizing that Jesus called that generation. It wasn't only, the standard rapture seeker, always says, well, it's not, yeah, that generation won't pass away when all the signs are there. Then how come there's so many other verses like Matthew 16:4, where Jesus is calling them an evil and adulterous generation who seeks after a sign? Matthew 3:7, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come, talking to Sadducees and Pharisees of that time. Matthew 12:7, spirits came out, and that is the way it will also be with this evil generation, not something else. They were that wicked and despised generation. Luke 9:14, Jesus answered and said, you unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Acts 2:40. In other words, he solemnly testified and kept exhorting them, be saved from this perverse generation. These are things we can know. We can't speculate about why they didn't have bathrooms. We can't just automatically, because the rapture loving, waiting for Armageddon when it's already past crowd are always saying, no, Jesus is going to rule in that fake city of Jerusalem and that fake Israel for 1,000 years on the ground there. I'm still waiting for someone to show me one Bible verse that says that. Don't show me Zechariah, because that doesn't say that. Now, did Aleister Crowley interrogate Rudolf Hess? Who was Rudolf Hess? Well, we do know, this is part 3. Was Crowley involved in the interrogation of Rudolf Hess? Maxwell Knight from MI5 was a bisexual and a friend of Lord Trogonor. Knight had a private menagerie, and when Knight's wife died in 1936 from a suspected overdose of painkillers, rumors circulated that she committed suicide after participating in a magical ritual with Aleister Crowley. Rudolf Hess. He carried out a disastrous peace mission. Let's get a little background on Rudolf Hess. You highlight it, right click it, search it, comes up with Rudolf Hess, very, very leading Nazi German politician and leading member of the Nazi Party, appointed deputy Fuhrer in 1933, that very mysterious year. Hess held that position until 1941, when he flew solo to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate the United Kingdom's exit from World War II. He was taken prison and eventually convicted of crimes against peace. He was still serving his life sentence when he committed suicide in 1987. You know, Hitler became chancellor, he became deputy Führer. Wanted to do peace talks, was a member probably of fraternities, fraternal orders, Freemasons, the Golden Dawns, and all of these other things. Born in Alexandria, Egypt, and allegedly met with Ian Fleming and Aleister Crowley, two prominent British people who are very famous then and very famous now for all the wrong reasons. Here's a picture of Adolf and Rudolf Hess. Took a plane and tried to stop the war, so they say, and stayed in prison for 40 years. So, and there is some speculation. Was it a peace mission? How much of the occult is involved in the intelligence, not only in Britain, but in the United States? We do know that Marina Abramovich is great friends with Hillary Clinton and her campaign managers. Rudolf Hess. What is this? Weekly roundup of stories from the Sunday Post. The Devil and Mr. Bond, how the notorious occultists of Loch Ness inspired 007 and author Ian Fleming's villains. They had rocket packs in the 60s, and we were thought they'd be around by the 1980s. Let's see here. Aleister Crowley, one-time master of the Boleskine House near Inverness, met James Bond creator Ian Fleming during the Second World War and was not only the inspiration for the writer's first great villain, but also the grotesque template for most of those who followed. And the reason behind their unlikely, and it says only meeting, is stranger than the fiction itself. It sprang out of the historic arrival in Scotland, home of James Bond, of Hitler's number two man, Rudolf Hess. The revelation comes in a new book by former Marine commando turned author Mark Simmons. For the first time, it directly links Fleming's wartime service in naval intelligence, the people he met, and the adventures he had with scenes from the 007, that's James Bond tell. So we do know that now there is, supposed to be proof that Aleister Crowley was brought in to talk with Ian Fleming with military intelligence about how to frame this message. And these are Bond villains who became a blueprint for most of the Bond villains. So these things really happened. The Christian Observer, they had an article about it. Aleister Crowley and Adolf Hitler, the ideology of evil. Adolf Hitler and Aleister Crowley, the great black magicians of the 20th century, shared similar ideologies. Their worldviews were influenced by the European occult movements of the late 1800s and early 1900s, informed by the ideas of Freemasonry and Theosophy. Both of these significant personalities supported the doctrines of the survival of the fittest. That's Darwinism, that's eugenics, the primacy of the human will, and the idea of a feudal slave state. Canary Cry, both of these monstrous individuals were initiates in Luciferian secret societies. After World War I, Hitler was initiated into the Thule Society. Left click, highlight, right click, search. The Thule Society was a German occult, an occultist Völkisch group founded shortly after World War I, named after the mythical northern country in the Greek legend. All about white power, all about doing anything you can, for their version of peace. And if it involves keeping people in slave labor, even though it seems like, what do we know about slave labor based on the Bible? We know that the people of Israel were slaves. We know that that when people, that there were 10 plagues, and then finally Pharaoh said, I had enough, get them out. And they were throwing money. Here's our stuff, just leave. Everything was good until they got to the Red Sea and they said, this looks dangerous. I want to go back. Back to where their children were being sacrificed, back where they were slaves. But they could get, maybe a drink every night and a hot meal, and they could still have sex even though their male children were being sacrificed. They still thought that was good enough. So that's what we know about what slaves can be like. They don't know they're slaves. And all the way to the time of Jeremiah, the Jews were constantly going like, when things get rough, I want to go back to Egypt and serve other gods. And they did. So that's just more connections to the evil. And, and they can say it's the center of conspiracy theories, but there's certain things, and I'm telling you what I believe. And everybody has to make up their own mind about what they believe. I know the winners of the wars rewrite history. It's my job for myself, and since I feel like I'm called to preach, to share what I believe about the extent of the lies, and not to worry about things that, there are secret things of God that we'll never know. Why some things didn't have to go to the bathroom. We do know that Jesus says, don't worry about, you know, keep yourself clean, because what you eat, goes out in the draught. He's talking about it goes out in your pee and your poop. We know that people pooed back then. We know that angels don't have sex with people because it says when the seven brothers that had one wife, whose husband will she be in heaven? You said you err because you don't know the scriptures. In heaven, you're going to be like the angels, where they're not made for sex. There are certain things we know, but those are the things that people love to speculate about. So the Golden Dawn, the Rosicrucians, the John Birch Society, Aleister Crowley. Look for more, information coming about that. Enochian magic, that's based on this love for Enoch and the book of Enoch, which is not scripture. And finally, in closing, my last movie I would like you to look at with fresh eyes if you haven't seen it. It's called A Cure for Wellness, where they want you to drink water, but the water's poison. It's a 2016 psychological neo-gothic. They call it a horror film, but it's not a slasher film. The plot is that there's a wellness center in the Swiss Alps based on something from 1927 in which, a baron who desired an heir of pure blood married his sister, performs hellish experiments on peasants to find a cure. The deal is the baron had devised a process to filter the water through the bodies of humans and distill it into a life-giving essence. Volmer uses the patients as filters for this process so that they can live forever. So, a rather short video for me tonight, but it's things I know. It's things I know that the United States didn't win the war with atomic weapons based on math that doesn't work, their quantum physics and their Einsteinism. Those things are fake. It's a rewritten history made to keep us in fear as slaves, thinking we're free in a country that allows abortion, to where with the saline solutions, they're burning babies alive. And if they could, they would make it legal for, burn your baby on the altar. Who cares? That's the world we live in. That's the world that, you know, is not going to change. It's the world we have to run away from. And that's why I do this. And that's why I share what I believe. And with that, I'd like to close by reminding you it's a flat earth nation. The golden age is past. Mud flood was Armageddon. And I'm never going to tell you anything else. Why would I? I'm trying to prove I have your best interest at heart. Amen. Hallelujah. Aho. And do me a favor, if you've liked any part of this video, do that, like and subscribe, and leave comments. And I'll leave the chat room open if you have anything to say. Aho.